educator for New Haven and several other communities around New Haven, and more importantly than that, a champion for this issue and so many others when it comes to fighting for working families here in Connecticut. Yeah, Allyx is clapping, but we should clap for the senator. And then right to my left is Kristen Budanowicz, who is the Director of Systems and Policy Planning for the Office of Early Childhood, somebody who will talk a lot about some of the great work that's been done in the last legislative session and how we're going to move forward. But before we get to the policy, I want to talk about people, because at the end of the day, really all of us do this because of kids and because of people. And because we're joined by Treena, I want to start with Treena to talk about some of the experiences that you had, maybe before you wound up here, with finding quality and affordable early child education for your family.
It was a roller coaster.
Mine's working.
Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing today? All right, thank you for coming out. So I would say it was definitely a roller coaster, just trying to navigate and going on tours and checking out places. It was a lot, but once I came across Friends Center for Children, it was just like everything just fell right into place. And I'm happy with the decision that I made.
Allyx, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you hear anecdotally in the community. Obviously, you are one of the biggest providers, if not the biggest provider of early child education in the city. What are you hearing from your clients and the folks that you work with about this issue and this problem that they're experiencing?
Sorry, this is going to be tricky with the on and off. I would say every day we're navigating families who are unable to find care. And that happens for a variety of reasons. One is the care, there isn't a slot. The second is it's too expensive. And then it may not be within their transportation range. And then it may not resonate with them, right? We're sort of forcing families to make choices that don't really feel good for them. And so the barriers are cost, accessibility first, cost, transportation, and then culturally relevant. And it is, one of the stories I tell is that we know that families are pregnant before their immediate families know, because they have to call us to get on a list, and so they'll say things like, please don't tell anybody, we haven't even told our parents. Which is, it's a really interesting place to be. And then think about what happens if that pregnant something happens. That same family has to call back and say, we actually need to let go of this. And they haven't told anybody else, but we're the ones that hold that. That is a very poorly designed system.
Yeah, and I vividly remember that because when my wife and I first learned we were going to have our first child, people said, you got to go get a slot. And I said, I don't even know the first thing about being a father. And you're saying this is the first thing I have to do. You don't know what you don't know, right? And so you're looking at places, you're trying to navigate this system, and you don't know it, and that's such a great point. I want to welcome Eva Bermudez Zimmerman here, who is the Coalition Director for Childcare for CT, and I would say the strongest advocate in the entire state of Connecticut for this issue. So welcome her with a round of applause. So Eva, if I could just jump right in. Allyx has a mic that you might share. Talk a little bit about what Allyx was just talking about. We're talking about sort of the barriers to access and the challenges that people that you represent through your coalition are facing right now when it comes to accessing that quality and affordable childcare.
Well, a little bit of the backstory for those who don't know or are not familiar with Childcare for CT. The coalition was created in desperation. Organizers, advocates throughout the state of Connecticut during COVID realized that the spotlight was on childcare when parents couldn't go to work, and they were desperate to figure out how in the world were they going to survive this pandemic, when in fact their children also need to go back to school or go to school, and they want to make sure that they had income on their table coming into their home. So that birth of that desperation brought to light some of the things that Allyx just mentioned. And it's not just for the traditional parent, right? Two-family home. It's also single parents. It's parents who are adoptive. We've met great-grandparents raising their great-grandchildren who do not qualify for DCF funding. there's so many scenarios out there of non-traditional homes, non-traditional work hours that were part of that desperation that made this coalition come together. And because of that, the organizing after 4 years allowed us to advocate very well and very hard for the Universal Child Care Endowment. So this past legislative session, we were very lucky and fortunate that all the mechanisms of advocacy, working with the legislature, with the governor, and the parent advocacy, the child care centers like this space, going out on their limb, sacrificing their time, sacrificing, all of the attention that they have for their families to make sure that this was a victory for the future of Connecticut. So.
And we want to get to the endowment, but before we get there, I think it's important for folks to just see the picture of maybe how difficult this was and how challenging this was. I think my wife and I spend almost as much on our child care as we do for our mortgage, right? And that's a story that replicates across the state. I'm wondering if you and Allyx might talk about some of the hard numbers of what you see, right? How much of people's income are they putting towards this when really that's just unaffordable? We talk a lot about Alice families, right, through United Way's work. Just too many families in the state of Connecticut, they're working maybe 2 or 3 jobs, and yet they still cannot afford the basic necessities of life. And I'm wondering if you can kind of put some color onto that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because that was in my head, but I wanted to
I'm trying to be the good Oprah.
You are,
here,
you're fantastic. You can just follow me around all the time, or I can you, and we can. So I just want to put a point on it. 27% of household income in the state of Connecticut goes to child care. That's huge. I mean, think about that, right? And so what that means is that people are not buying houses. They're actually 1 in 5 people are unable to go to work because they can't afford it. So we're losing the workforce. We have a labor shortage because of this. We're living paycheck to paycheck, right? If 27% of your income is putting, or then you're making choices that may not be the best choice for your child because you are forced to do that. So when you're seeing families who are working 2nd or 3rd shifts who are bringing their children with them to work because they can't find care, we don't have enough of evening and weekend care. I mean, this is a crisis, and as Ava said, COVID sort of let everyone else see it. We've known this for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And for concrete numbers of the 27%, if you live in Fairfield County, you can be paying up to $35,000 for 1 child. The average is anywhere between $16,000 to $23,000, and that really depends on where you live in Connecticut. So if you're in Eastern Connecticut, infant care could be $16,000. If you're in Greater Hartford, you're looking at $18,000. If you're here in New Haven, you'd be very fortunate to pay less than $21,000 for 1 child for a year. And for those who don't have kids or haven't had kids in a long time, because it's by slot, the automatic assumption for a lot of new parents is, well, I'll just put my child for 2 days a week, and then my mother or my friend or someone else in the family will supplement that care. And then the obvious answer from a lot of the child care centers and spaces, I cannot accommodate 2 days a week because you're taking up a slot for a child full time. So if you're a lucky parent who gets a reduced cost slot for 2 days a week, that reduction is not half off. It's maybe 20%, 30%, because you're taking up the spot of a child that could be there full time. So the cost is very exorbitant.
And again, I want to move towards this really great legislative session. We will in a moment, but let's talk about the educator side, because that's another side of this that I think is really important. I told this story the day that there was the day without childcare on the New Haven Green. I told this story about how at the place that my children go, which we totally love, my kids started asking where one of their favorite teachers was, and they were told that one of the young educators that was working there had decided to go into working as a barista because she would make more money doing that than she would educating a child. And I have never forgot that, because to me it's just such an insane indicator of how backwards this is, that somebody can make more money serving a cup of coffee, which is important obviously for all of us, and every job has value, but there's no job that's more valuable than to actually serve and educate young children. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the stresses on providers finding people that can work and to actually compensate them for what they do.
What brought me into this work was representing the childcare workforce. So I spent over 11 years representing childcare providers with SEIU, Service Employees International Union. Here in the state of Connecticut, they represent the biggest grouping of childcare workers, childcare center workers, and as well as home-based family childcare providers. And in that time, the decade plus, like Allyx and others mentioned, this problem, this crisis is not something that happened just overnight or 2 or 3 years in. It's been decades of. Those workers that I've met were making, before the union, minimum wage, with, if you're the lucky few that have the ability to collect a bargain, then maybe, depending on your childcare center, $2 or $3 more than your minimum wage. For home-based providers, you're looking at about, this is a hard question,
Yeah.
and the reason why it's a little difficult is because if you go by hour, a lot of childcare providers, because they don't do traditional hours, especially if you're in the home-based setting, you could be providing care 15, 14 hours. There are some providers who are 24 hours. So when you do 24 hours and you divide that by the kids that are in your space, in theory, you could only be still making $5 an hour. If you're in a childcare center where you're looking at more apples to apples, what your minimum wage is because you don't own it or operate it, then you're looking at now, because of these changes, because of the spotlight, $2 or $3 more. But unfortunately, still the grand majority of providers in the state of Connecticut, they're lucky to make $1 above minimum wage.
I would just say we are, in the state of Connecticut, 95% female and disproportionately women of color. We are paid below 97% of all other jobs everywhere. We are steeped in that because of the racism and sexism that is in our system. And this is an intentional outcome of those systems. And so I would say it's very clear that we are asking the women who care for the youngest versions of ourselves to subsidize our entire economy. And until we stop doing that, we are going to fail as a system.
Yeah, thank you. So, Senator, I want to turn the conversation to you. So, Ava used the word crisis, and I think what she was saying was that this crisis became more apparent to more people in the COVID years, but obviously we've all known for many years this was a problem, and this is something you clearly have worked on. But this legislative session, specifically with the passage of SB1, I think has been transformational when it comes to this issue. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how SB1 came to fruition this year and the process of schoolhouse rocking that bill from conception, realization of a crisis, to finding the political will to do something big and bold and actually getting it passed. Big question, but.
Good. Good. Well, thank you. First of all, I wanted to commend the Comptroller for all of the great work that he does on so many fronts as an advocate in the state, and also, of course, what Allyx is doing here is a model for what child care should be throughout the whole state and the nation, and Ava as well as an extraordinary advocate. So as the Comptroller said, is that we have known for a long time that there is a severe crisis in early childhood education and preparation in the state. But this year we were able to get all the planets aligned because it was something that was a priority for the administration, thanks to Commissioner Bai. The governor had a plan. We had a plan, and obviously it was the highest priority bill for us, hence it was named Senate Bill number 1. It was also a high priority for the House of Representatives and Speaker Ritter. So we came together with 3 proposals that wound up being blended in many ways, and the result was the Child Care Endowment program that's been created with the goal in a few years that no family earning less than $100,000 will have to pay for child care, and even those above $100,000 would only have to pay no more than 7% for child care. But let me talk a little about the background of that. One of the challenges, of course, is that we've known for years, and COVID really did make this even more urgent, the sense that so many families suffered so many disruptions during COVID, is that we know that there are so many children who come to kindergarten who are really not prepared to be there. My daughter-in-law has taught at inner city school in New Haven and now in Hartford. My niece teaches at early elementary grades in Norwalk. And it is heartbreaking that teachers can tell from day one, or at least in the first week, which children have had a quality preschool program, quality daycare, quality preschool, as opposed to those who have not. And for those who have not, school is a struggle from day one. And we know that in many cases, children never recover from that lack of preparation for kindergarten, in the sense that a couple of years into school, they're trailing badly in terms of attainment levels. They become frustrated. They have a sense of their own deficiencies in many cases. When they're a little older, they start to become truant. And a little older than that, they start to get into trouble with the juvenile court. And then when they're 16, they often drop out, and by then they may only be in 9th grade because they've repeated one or more grades along the way, and their attainment level may only be at 5th or 6th grade. So they're out of school, not employed, not employable, and they're the cohort of 16 to 24-year-olds that the study group this year, led by the Dalio Foundation and the Conference of Connecticut Municipalities, look to target. But that would not be a problem if everyone came to school ready to be there. So we, unfortunately, we have not paid enough attention to birth to 5. One teacher said to me recently, well, I think we'd all notice if we took kids out of school at age 8 and then brought them back at age 13. Well, the same thing is happening if nothing happens to stimulate them and get them ready from birth to 5. And that is a real problem. And we are now addressing that, I think, with what the bill that we passed this year, and building upon that, incrementally funding the trust fund, planning an outreach so that more people have the coverage. Because there is just an extraordinary difference. That is one of the great indicators of inequality in this society. Is between children who come to kindergarten from an enriched background at age 5 and those who don't. My daughter-in-law said it's just heartbreaking that there are kids that she's seen who have never been read to. No one in the house reads. There are no books in the house. I mean, it's just appalling. And the teachers have to try to overcome that. And there are other kids who come to school already having been read to, with books in every room in the house, and have traveled extensively and have been to libraries and museums, and they are fully ready for kindergarten. I was at my wife and I were at the home of a young couple who were friends of ours last night for dinner. Young African American couple. They have a 5-year-old son who is excited about starting kindergarten. One of the parents is a policy researcher for a nonprofit. The other is a healthcare administrator. They provide lots of enrichment for their son. They're each able to work from home a couple of days a week by Zoom, so they're with him even more. In the last year, this little boy has been to Chicago, Florida, Aruba, and Portugal. And the other day he was playing in the yard, and he saw a plane going overhead and heard it. And he looked up and he said, I wonder whether that's JetBlue, United, or American. So this kid is well traveled. He's only 5 years old, but you have a sense of the enrichment of what he has seen. Not to brag about my own grandchildren, but we all love to brag about our grandchildren, don't we? But my youngest granddaughter, she's now going to 3rd grade. A couple of years ago, when she was in 1st grade, she spilled a box of crayons, and her father said to her, Isabel, pick up those crayons. And she said, Daddy, you could also say gather or collect. And, again, she was a little show-off, but still, but just that shows you. And whereas her mother and my niece have just said that it's so challenging to try to find a level to connect with kids who come in from very deprived backgrounds, lacking vocabulary, lacking any of the skills of the sort of the acculturation that you normally assume in a child who should be kindergarten ready. So we are really addressing that now in a belated way with Senate Bill 1, the legislation that we passed this year. My hope is that we will continue to build on that, to fund that trust fund, and to expand coverage in it, and that'll be transformative for Connecticut.
Senator, you and I both know the governor really well, and I think in all the things that he has done in his almost 8 years as governor, this is the thing he's most proud of getting done and most excited about. And you can tell that when he talks about this. You could tell that at that bill signing that he did. I'm wondering, given your incredible career of passing so many pieces of significant legislation, where this ranks for you.
This ranks very high. This is something I've been working on for a number of years, and that's why I'm so gratified that it came to fruition this year. We had a great partnership with the administration, with Commissioner Bai as the point person on that, working with the House and Senate. As you know, as a former House member and a leader in the House and a committee chair, the House and Senate are not always aligned in terms of priorities, but this year we were on that issue. There was a sense of urgency in the majority leadership in both chambers. Speaker Ritter and Majority Leader Rojas and Senator Duff, our majority leader, and I were fully committed to a major bill. We weren't looking to do something that could be seen as a token effort, but we wanted to begin something that would be far-reaching and that we could build on. So every now and then the planets align, and this was the year that it happened, and we need to keep that momentum going.
I want to just put a fine point on this. We are the most comprehensive early care and education legislation in the country right now. Yeah, it's really important. Ever. Yeah, Miriam reminded me to say ever. So it's 0 to 5 in scope. It's a $16,000, 16 slot increase for the number of families served. It has a parent portal, which will act as sort of a common application. It achieves pay parity between early care and education teachers and public school teachers. It creates a permanent endowment, which is what we're talking about. And it has a facilities grant, so thinking about the facilities. All that is true, and it's really remarkable. And I believe that two things can be true at the same time. We also need to do more. This initiative is what we could do at this point in time because we had amazing champions like Senator Looney and Childcare for Connecticut and the governor and everyone else. There's so many people we could talk about. However, we will serve about 52,000 children by 2035 with this legislation. That means we will only be serving about 50% of the people who need early care and education in the state. Yes, I am that person who always talks about the and more. So this is incredible, and we can't lose sight of that. And we are in the analogy I use, we've done a triathlon, we're in the last leg. And it's only from leadership, like the people sitting here, who make this happen. It's parents, it's advocates, it's committed public servants, and it's leadership, and it's you all. So we're gonna need your help over the next 5 to 7 years to keep this momentum going to really fix the problem.
I promise that Allyx, yeah, clap for that. Allyx and I are speaking via ESP right now. I want you to know that. There's no script here, but we're going to take it kind of where she went because I wanted to bring Ava in for a second on this topic before we talk about implementation and what's next. For the very point that Allyx talked about, right? These things don't just happen. Yes, there are incredible legislators. Senator Looney talked about the cohesion between the governor and the speaker and the Senate president, but this doesn't happen overnight. It happens through a lot of hard work. It happens through a lot of people taking time out of their busy schedule to come to the Capitol, to testify, to write their elected officials. And Ava obviously is the incredible force behind that. But I want to have you talk a little bit about the coalition that has been built around this and how social change coalitions, to Alex's point, can't just stop with one bill or one massive bill, even if that bill is transformational. Talk about that a little bit if you can.
Oftentimes the saying in organizing is that you want to build a seat at the table, right? You want to make sure that you fight your way into a seat at the table. And in this coalition, I think the way that we see it is that we were building the table. Rather than begging or scrambling to move a seat and pull it up next to someone else, we were literally building everything as we went because there wasn't really an infrastructure or a roadmap in Connecticut for what we were trying to build. Oftentimes, every single year prior to the discussion of an endowment or an overhaul on childcare, a lot of the legislators were confused. Not Senator Looney, he was well versed, but the many others would tell us, well, what crisis? Or we gave you money for Care for Kids, a subsidy program for childcare, and we gave you a lot of money. That should be sufficient. Not really understanding the day-to-day. No surprise, a lot of the legislative body do not have kids, so that connection to childcare and how much it costs wasn't really there. So it was years of educating. And then on the advocate side, back to the question, we didn't know what we wanted. we were scrambling ourselves. There are some nonprofits that said, well, the road to fix this is making sure that you just pay the providers what they're worth. And there are other nonprofits that said the road is making sure that we decrease the cost of childcare for parents. And when we were discussing in the very early stages of building a coalition, just, you know, a few grouping of nonprofits, we had 4-hour sessions where we were in the back and forth like a Thanksgiving table, all in good harmony here with the intention of trying to figure out what's next. And then that took literally 2-3 years of figuring out what do we want, how do we create a space where it does incorporate the voices of parents, the guardians, that it's not just one type of parent, and it does it in hand with the providers who've been working so hard to make sure that they're advocating for themselves. So it literally took years to get to the coalition being what it is now, and now we're a happy family. You know, our Thanksgiving dinner is very quiet and humble because we figured out a pathway to get there. Part of that pathway was convincing the governor, and then the creation of the Blue Ribbon Panel. So if there was a culmination of thoughts and people and really focusing on what's next, the Blue Ribbon Panel in Connecticut was a very, quite the undertaking of research, hearing voices, making sure that the Office of Early Childhood had more capacity, had more staff to take this new transformation on, and not doing something that was gonna be an overhaul that was, you know, in a year or in a day, understanding that this was gonna be a decade of effort and work and all of these ideas culminating into the endowment. So the Blue Ribbon Panel led us and allowed us to really share our voices, share that parent advocacy. The coalition and different partners were part of that. And then we were creating a roadmap that we were able to deliver to legislators and say, look, we have the research, we did it, we understand what's happening, now can we make this possible? So when we went to legislative body and they were asking us, what are you going to do? We said we had a plan. We were ready to go. Where in subsequent years, we'd go and you'd say, we just want money, and we keep throwing money at the problem, and nothing would happen. The outcomes would be exactly the same. But this year, 2025 session, we knew exactly what we wanted, how we'd get there. We had other state examples, and we said, we're gonna do it better than them.
That's great.
If I might add to that, Eva's exactly right. One of the challenges here was building a coalition that would be able to bring the issue front and center. As we all know, the K-12 system, and even that is, of course, not as well funded as we would like it to be, and there are certainly gaps in that. But for K-12 education, we are hearing all the time from the mayors, from the first selectmen, from the teachers unions, from the school administrators, from the State Department of Education. So there is an institutional advocacy and lobbying every year at the Capitol, pushing hard for more for K-12 education. You did not have that sort of organized constituency pushing for birth to 5 programs until recently. There were people who, like Eva and Allyx, you know, who were able to make the case and really riveting presentations at public hearings, but there wasn't really a network engaged in making sure that age group was going to be seen with the same sense of urgency that kids from 5 to 18 were seen with. And I think we're now approaching that point, and that's why this year we were able to bring this legislation forward, because I remember in a couple of meetings with advocates for the K-12 system, and they were pushing rightly as they should, and I said, you know, we hope to do what you're looking for this year, but we have another need this year that we're going to have to give priority to, and that's birth to 5. And of course, that's not their constituency. You can't blame them, but they're advocating for the K-12 system. But we had to, in effect, create the wedge that would bring the birth to 5 advocates to the table, as Allyx and Eva said.
So I want to bring Kristen in now because we've talked about coalition building, we've talked about the legislative process, but that last mile, in some cases, is the most important one and the hardest one, which is implementation. And so, Kristen, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you guys enter the conversation here, in the sense that this really amazing thing has been passed, and there was a couple different things that are passed this year, maybe talk about the portal too. How do you implement this to make sure that the families that it's intended to reach actually get the help they need?
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so the implementation conversations have begun. We are trying to be extremely intentional, I think, as we are moving through the implementation phases. So the first 2 years of the endowment really are for planning. Expanding additional spaces each year, increasing compensation for the workforce, and then kind of those wraparound bills. So you mentioned the portal, Ava or Allyx, I think, mentioned the portal as well. So we're trying to be extremely intentional and listen as well to what exactly the families need, what the providers need, and how we can really meet the needs of the entire field. So with the first 2 years, going back to that planning piece, there will be something called the local needs assessment, which is an opportunity for the local governance partners, which are a combination of the LECCs, which are the early childhood collaboratives, and a combination of what the school readiness councils were, which are to provide a holistic view at the local level to really understand what the needs are of that town. So are there transportation barriers? Are there, children with special needs that are not receiving the services that they need to receive? So as the expansion continues over the endowment period, over the years, expansion will be based on the needs of the local towns.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Allyx,
Yeah, I just want to lift up that one of the issues that we have as a state is we actually, because we've ignored this segment of the population and this infrastructure, we don't have the data that we need to make informed and thoughtful decisions. So what I'm hearing OEC talk about when they talk about these local governance partners and this needs assessment is beginning that process of how we actually identify what the needs are in each community. And if they're requiring that as part of this rollout of these funds, you then start to get a landscape analysis of each community. You weave it together so you have a statewide picture. And it's really critical that we put early care and education spots in the hands of the families and the communities that need it, not just everywhere. It could be everywhere, but we don't know that yet.
Yeah, and I think just to build off of that too is as we think about what the local needs are, who is at that table, and being extremely intentional that we have a spot for parents, the parent ambassadors, the liaisons, the school board, the superintendent, as an example, to make sure that we are really approaching with a holistic view to meet the needs of the families in each town.
I do have a question. I would like to know how exactly will you guys be going out into the community to gather this information to meet the needs of these towns and these cities in the state of Connecticut during this process of enrollment and figuring out everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the next couple months, we will be doing at least 5 listening sessions statewide, which we will have representation from our parent cabinet, and the legislature will be available, but everybody really wants to listen to what those needs are. And I think making sure that parents have a seat at that table with the LGPs is an extremely important step to answering that question as well. So there will be a local needs assessment. There is also a parent caregiver survey that will be disseminated this fall. So all of the information collected in the parent caregiver survey, as well as the information that we will be learning from the local needs assessment, which will be conducted by the LGPs, local governance partners, I apologize, will help guide exactly the answer to that question and tell the localities, the municipalities, what it is their families need, which then they can let OEC know as part of an application process for expanded spaces, and we can offer spaces based on what the local needs are of that town.
So with that being said, I'd like to know, like, how exactly are you gonna get that information out to the families? And also, would you be providing, like, if it's in a setting where they're sitting down and they're asking questions, or is it gonna be something that's done online, or is it gonna be mailed out to parents? Like, how exactly are you gonna get it out to the community?
So we are working with our partners at UConn, who are assisting us with the parent caregiver survey specifically, and there is a robust recruitment plan. So they will be out in local libraries. The survey will be available online. It can be done in person at community fairs, and those types of opportunities. Providers will also be sent the link to the survey. So there's a very robust execution plan for that parent caregiver survey specifically, but we are always open to ideas. So if there is certain feedback or spaces in your specific community that you would like to have us come to execute that survey, we are open to those suggestions.
Ava?
Oh, as a coalition, we are also part of that plan. So any opportunity to mention to the community that we are doing, that we're having a town hall, a roadshow, a conversation, as a coalition, we will be there front and center promoting anything that the Office of Early Childhood is disseminating or doing to make sure that parents have engagement. We are fortunate here that in this scenario, the conversation of implementation is hand in hand with parents and advocates. And I say fortunate because oftentimes when the everyday person thinks of government, they think of this thing out there that's not tangible. Oh, government does that. I don't know what they do. They do things. But when we're thinking about government in the childcare policy, it's an interactive relationship. Those LGPs, the local government partners, were part of that creation and conversation from the Blue Ribbon panel, from talking to parents and saying, well, how can we do things differently? The Office of Early Childhood, this government entity said, how can we actually make sure that we're transforming childcare in a vision that you like, that you want to be part of? And in that conversation, now in policy and implementation, it's really taking that feedback and putting it into practice. An easier way to digest what is an LGP. Well, rather than having this entity doing for you and you not having a conversation about what are they doing, the LGPs allows an opportunity for the community, the parent, and everyone else in that community make that decision and figure out the guidance of what's next together.
I want to leave, we have a couple minutes left, and I want to leave some time for people in the audience to maybe ask some questions, but I want to maybe end where Allyx was sort of talking about earlier, which is, I was in the legislature, and when I was a freshman legislator in my early 20s, I passed a bill that I was incredibly proud of that dealt with the opioid epidemic. And I won all these awards, and I felt so good about myself. And then my next door neighbor's daughter actually died of an overdose. And it was the most powerful reminder that I could have ever gotten about the fact that you can't just pass one bill and think you've solved a crisis. You can't just do one thing and think that that's the answer. And in government, a lot, we do that, right? We create a commission and we say, we've solved it. We've passed one bill, we say we've solved it. That is not the case here. And I'm wondering if, despite all the progress that was made this session, that we're all incredibly proud of, and all of you should be incredibly proud of because it is an amazing accomplishment, we succeed. It's like when you win the championship, you take maybe one day off to celebrate, and then you get back to the gym and figure out how you're gonna win the back-to-back. How are we gonna go back-to-back here in the state of Connecticut and make sure that we keep winning championships for these kids?
Well, I think that, as was said, we made a breakthrough this year, but we need to keep pushing on this front because I think we need to keep funding the trust fund, add funding to the trust fund. I think we need to reach implementation even sooner, full implementation sooner than the bill that we passed this year will provide for. Make sure that we move ahead so that we have plenty of resources for infant and toddler care, which is the most expensive care altogether and needs the most intensive care and the most and the smallest ratio of providers to children. That has to be incorporated and funded even better than what we're talking about doing under this bill. So there is plenty of room for advancement, and I certainly commit that I'm going to keep pressing on all of this to make sure that what we've done this year is a promising start, but should not be seen as checking the box and moving on.
Yes. I think we have to acknowledge the tension between listening and the urgency that people feel as from the implementation side. And I think that we need to continue funding what we've established, and then we need to pivot and think about what can be added. And so, for example, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is infrastructure. If we're trying to add 16,000 new slots, and we've only allocated $80 million in funding for facilities, this facility cost us $6 million, you can see we're not going to get to 16,000 slots.
You don't have to be the comptroller to know that.
So, right. And so the bottom line is, how do we start thinking about infrastructure, and how do we leverage opportunities that we have for infrastructure across our state? So, for example, we could ask that or think about how we, I don't want to say require because that could make some people, but I'm going to say it anyway, where we require certain builds. So if you're doing a build over a certain dollar threshold, you need to put in a child care facility on the ground floor. And for that, you would get a tax break. The governor has thought about this before, but we're not seeing it implemented. So how do we make that? Because if you did that, you would solve the infrastructure problem across our state immediately for childcare. You would also reduce costs for childcare providers, which would then allow us to reinvest in quality. Because if we're not paying rent or overhead for our spaces, you automatically can increase teacher salaries, you can reallocate those funds. So those are just some creative ways we should be thinking about the role of infrastructure. We offer free housing to our teachers. That is an infrastructure solution to a problem.
Yeah.
So there are lots that we can and should be doing.
Couple minutes left. Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Norida Braili, and I count myself as one of the very lucky parents to have a child at Friends Center for Children. I'm so grateful for your advocacy and your work. I have two questions, because I do this work at the national level. One is, you've really moved from crisis and a problem to be managed into a public good and a guarantee in Connecticut. And I'm just curious about what you've seen as the narratives that are most effective in moving the conversation. And shifting the politics of the state. I understand with all the organizing you've been leading from the ground up. So that's a question on narrative and power building.
Can people hear?
No.
In the back? Let's give you, thank you, Treena. That's okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. Okay. Is this better? I'm going to try to do that quicker. So just a question around how you've been able to shift the narrative from a problem to be managed, childcare, early childhood education, into a public good, a guarantee, and how we nationalize that, how we get more states to pick that up, and ultimately how we get Congress to really invest in it in the way that we need to. That's a question on sort of the politics and narrative. I then have a question for you, Kristen. Because the state is pouring a lot of money into the ECE with the idea of subsidizing better wages, which could make it even more of a magnet for investor-owned childcare programs to expand. How will Connecticut protect against the financialization in the sector? And what kind of guardrails will you adopt to protect taxpayer investments from profiteering to ensure that really the families and the workers are the beneficiaries of the state's terrific commitments and everything you have won in this legislative cycle?
So I'm gonna dive in here. For the narrative, I hate to say it, but in the beginning of this journey as a coalition, people don't care about babies. We really, honestly, people in this room, you're here for a reason. You know, there's a connection or inspiration that brought you here. But when we tried branding and messaging with professional companies and we launched the campaign and our logo as a coalition was baby-centered and our messaging was baby-centered, we were not getting traction. We weren't getting traction with businesses. They're like, why do I care about that child? That's not mine. We'd actually hear that in legislative hearings from legislators saying, my demographics in my town are not really children. It's mostly older people. I've heard from my constituents that we don't care about those people's babies. So we had to pivot. Our messaging, we did communications and rebranding workshop. We went to seminars. Then we hired a professional comms team that worked in DC and did national campaigns. We were very fortunate to get the same company that did the campaign for Vermont's Universal Childcare program, and they did a payroll tax there. And then we pivoted into workforce and workforce expansion. So when we did that and we were trying to convince legislators, look, sure, we want to help babies, but this will allow for your towns to have more jobs. It'll keep people in their homes. It'll have working class size, working families making more money. So those questions about housing, those questions about any kind of income disparity, if you have a lot more money coming back into your households because you don't have to dish out 16 grand into childcare, then that's stimulating the economy. And that's when we started hearing the shift from business owners and from legislators who just didn't get it. And then diving into your second question, on the national, or part of the first, right, the national spectrum, we launched a Morning Without Childcare here in the state of Connecticut, this annual rally where all of the childcare parents, advocates came together. We'd have every year about 2,000 parents, 15 locations statewide advocating, demanding for change. And that question of like, what does the narrative look like, took fire and it went national. So there's a day without childcare that was inspired by Connecticut's Morning Without Childcare. In Congress, with that aspect, they're cutting funding left and right. That is no surprise. If you're looking at the news, that is happening. In going back to Comptroller Scanlon's question of how do you protect or what's next, part of our protection here in Connecticut, we just had this amazing victory. We don't want it stolen from us because the feds are now saying you're going to have $1 billion shortage because we're pulling our federal funding for everything else. So in that protection, it's working in collaboration with legislators to say we understand that we have a healthcare crisis, right behind us. It's looming. It's a shadow on our backs. Let's figure out a way to keep healthcare a priority, but still make sure that the victories that we had in childcare are right there front and center and helping people, because the same people who have those healthcare crises that might be using Medicaid are the same people that are also using childcare. It's one and the same. So you can't, this is not about transferring money from one pocket to the next. This is about giving opportunities and opening up your pockets if you have the money, and Connecticut does, to give opportunities to those families to stay in Connecticut.
One thing I would just add, I know Senator Looney's going to jump in here, is that something that I experience with this is a generational difference, right? People in the 80s, my parents, on a single income, making under $50,000 a year, could handle their life because things were just different in the 80s. And so there's this sense among perhaps older generations that look at my generation and the generation below me who have kids now and are saying, well, we did this, how come you can't do it? That's because a college degree doesn't mean what it did. That's because your rent is higher. That's because the childcare costs more. It's because you can't get a freaking job because AI now dominates all this single entry jobs for recent college graduates. So all of life is just so different. And I think so much of what Ava is not giving herself enough credit for is just educating people about the differences of raising a child in 2025 versus 1975 or 1985 or even 1995. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for that work.
I think that's absolutely true. There was an article recently an economic article that pointed out in Connecticut now, a family of four has to be making more than $120,000 a year just to be considered in the middle class, or not even the higher part of the middle class. And that's just an extraordinary challenge that we have. One of the, in terms of building the coalition, it was important, I think, a key part of the breakthrough this year was to make sure that everyone knew that the challenge of quality preschool and daycare was not just a problem of urban low-income working people. it was a challenge for suburban middle-class people as well. When you get to $16,000 a year or more, that's a big hit for a middle-income family, not just a lower-income family. And I think that, and Connecticut is largely a middle-class dominated suburban state. One of our challenges, of course, in terms of making urban policy, I represent the city of New Haven, is that we don't have any big cities in Connecticut big enough to compel a political solution. We have to build coalitions with the suburbs, especially the first-ring suburbs. So, if you look at the neediest cities in the state, New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport together, those three cities have under 11% of the state's population combined. Whereas if you look at, Boston has a bigger percentage of the state of Massachusetts by itself than any of Connecticut's three cities combined. Actually, Providence is the largest city in New England relative to its state's population. It's about 19% of Rhode Island's population. And we all look with envy at New York because 43% of the legislators who are serving in Albany are representing districts for New York City. Makes you wonder why the capital's in Albany. But we have to build coalitions here because the urban base, while we have all the same challenges that urban areas have all over the country, we don't have compelling numbers or size. And so we have to build coalitions, and the only time we can make a breakthrough is when we engage the suburbs, especially the first-ring suburbs.
I think Kristen wants to jump in, then we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to highlight too, just building consensus around early childhood and why early childhood really is the return on investment. So people who may not directly benefit from this bill, you can talk to them about what that return on investment means for the economy. So every dollar that we spend on childcare or early childhood education in our state returns $7 back into the economy in the future. So that was a way for us to also communicate with those who couldn't understand or wrap their head around, well, why is the state making the investment in early childhood as opposed to Medicaid or health insurance, medical benefits, things like that.
Thank you. One more question from the audience?
Can you answer the question on private equity and guardrails?
Oh, yeah. So it is something that we are having conversations about at the state level. There was, or can't remember if there was proposed legislation, but we're having conversations about how we
so
can.
You said repeat the question. Can you just repeat the question for the audience? Nate, there you go.
Thank you. I'm just asking about the role of private equity and how how as you think about implementation, you're thinking about making sure that money goes and benefits the workers and the kind of people that we're talking about, and that it's like what kind of guardrails will you put in place to make sure that it's not just private equity coming in and taking advantage of this huge victory?
Yeah, it's a very relevant concern. And conversations that we are having at the state level about how we can protect from that. And I think, going back to the local needs assessment and really understanding what providers need in addition to what families need and how we can protect their interests as well as those of the families. I don't have a great answer for you at this point in time, but I can tell you that it is something that we have
I
continuous
have
conversations about.
An A answer.
Yeah.
A answer.
Okay.
So echoing what Kristen said, that we have been having conversations on making sure that the policy end doesn't create a system where the big equity firms are gobbling up all the money. For those who are not familiar, in Massachusetts and New York City, and now it's springing up everywhere, now this conversation of universal endowments being created or universal child care major cities being created, where hedge funds are buying child care centers. Guidepost is the biggest child care brand out there that opened up locations in Utah, all through Utah and Colorado, and then overnight in the same week closed 12 locations and only gave a 30-day notice to their parents because they were turning over that property for profit, and they had only existed 4 or 5 years. A lot of private equity firms are doing that all through the United States, and they're using the advantage of state-funded programming, state funding systems for the actual purchasing of the building, so getting free money from the state, then money for raises for their staff to do all this renovation, do this amazing work for education, but then they leave. So back to your question, we looked at legislation in Massachusetts where they went hard on no private equity to mimic that for this bill. Our version of tackling in this bill when we were working with the Senate team was putting very specific caps on how much you have to pay your staff and how much you can theoretically pay yourself. So it's not as blatant as Mass where it says, hey, you can't have private equity or a hedge fund purchase a property. So in theory, if you have a hedge fund, anyone here, come, purchase a property, do childcare, that's great. But just know that you can't line your pockets as a CEO and pay yourself $500,000 as the childcare center director, that you're never there. And it makes, it solidifies that anyone in childcare here of SB1, you have to pay your workforce what they're worth, and you have to be able to walk away as a director knowing that the money is spread evenly and equitably.
I think we have time.
Yeah.
So one more hand up in the back, if Nate can go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this important panel. My name is Katerina, and I work on workforce development with immigrant women. And I wanted to ask a question related to that. A lot of studies say that 1 in 4 children in Connecticut has an immigrant parent. So how are immigrant communities being thought of in the next few years, and specifically their needs, and also reaching them, having cross-cultural and multilingual strategies?
She wants to take that.
I can start. It's a great question, and one that we have very frequently at OEC specifically. We are very fortunate, I think, to live in the state of Connecticut, and there are a lot of supports in place. But I think a big part of immigrant families in general is building trust at the community level and making them feel like they are safe enough to go out and seek the services that they need. So I think from a policy perspective, we're going to heavily rely on the councils, the local councils, local governing partners, to help build that trust within their community so that those families have a safe place to go to receive the services that they need.
Two thoughts come to mind in that question. Thank you for the question. One is just what does to me, that's a question about quality, the quality of the program, and how is that program meeting the needs of the community that it's serving. And so there's a quality side. Then there's a system side, which is what I'm hearing you talk a little about, Kristen. And I can say that I was in D.C. the day that, for a panel, the day that the administration acknowledged that they were changing the early Head Start and Head Start access, and they were sort of taking away rights for immigrants. And I texted our commissioner during that meeting, and I said, this just came out today. It'll be implemented in 30 days. What are we going to do about Connecticut families? And the immediate response was, I said, can we use the new legislation? And the immediate response was yes. Those families in Connecticut will be served because we have done this revolutionary movement in Connecticut where we can absorb all of the vitriol and dysfunction that's happening at the federal level, which is cutting people out. So those are the two things I would say in response to that question.
I want to thank our panel. I mean, this has been a great conversation. Again, want to thank Allyx and her team for putting on this incredible event, but really want to end just by thanking everyone in the audience. None of what any of these folks do is possible without the support of people like you in the audience and the coalition that has been built. That is parents and not parents, people who care about this for personal reasons and people who care about that from humanistic reasons. All of that doesn't happen overnight, and all of that is so important, especially in this time of great uncertainty with what's happening in Washington. We are very lucky, as has been said, that we are in Connecticut. We cannot completely inoculate ourselves from what happens in Washington, but we also can't just blame Washington for the reasons why we can't do big things. And we have done a big thing here in Connecticut that I, as a citizen of the state, am incredibly proud of. But as has been said, we have to keep doing big things in order to meet a big challenge. And that won't happen without the support of all of you and the great work of these people. So on behalf of all of us on the panel, thank you for being here. And thank you again for all of you for all the great work that you do.
Thank you all. Make sure you take a water bottle on your way out. They've been pre-washed for you.